Back with a new video, this time focused on some new character and epic hero ideas for Adeptus Mechanicus. Basically, some new generic character types and new epic hero kind of named characters that I would love to see on the tabletop for Adeptus Mechanicus. And originally I was going to make this a Reddit post, and so I started outlining some characters I thought would be cool, and then I realized it had turned into about a 2,000 word novel, so I thought it would make a great blog post instead. And for people that wanted to consume, would like to consume content, maybe in video format, or maybe would like to listen to it as they're doing something else, I thought I would make it available as a video as well. But you can also go to my website at grokvar.com to take a look at the article in its full glory. So as you can see, kind of headlining the piece here is a picture of Subdomina Khepra from the Mechanicus PC game. Like a lot of other AdMech players, I think she would be a great addition to as a new kind of epic name character on the tabletop, and I will get into that later in the video. But clearly she's definitely one of the fan favorites, and I wholeheartedly agree that she should be hopefully one of these days added to 40K on the tabletop. So just for some quick background, I'm a relatively new 40K player, started playing again in the fall of 2022 with my youngest son. My teenage son is now headed off to college, so our games might be a little less frequent, but I really got into 40K, like I said, towards the end of last year. I really was drawn to AdMech and did a lot of kind of early research into AdMech, bought the 8th edition codex, bought the 9th edition codex, and also picked up the fantastic Belisarius Call, the Great Work book by Guy Haley, which I heartily recommend for any AdMech fan. Fantastic book, which I'll get into a bit later, and which also has a couple of characters in there that I would also argue would make a great addition to the tabletop. So kind of how I structured the blog post is I kind of broke it into three sections here. One is I cover some generic leader characters I would like to see in the game, and then the second section is about named epic heroes I would like to see, and then finally I've just got some random, arguably somewhat crazy ideas on blue sky thinking, what would be cool maybe to see in AdMech, and maybe where there might be some cool synergies with other 40K factions and the like. So why don't we get started with looking at currently kind of doing a quick review of our generic leader characters that we have already before we get into the ones that I think would be great to add. Obviously the Skitarii Marshal, even though he's been nerfed a bit in 10th edition, he's a little bit weaker than he was in 9th, and he can only lead Vanguard and Rangers, which kind of sucks. And power level wise, he's definitely been given a nerf, but still I think a good character. Cybernetic, a datasmith. You can read my other articles for all the article about expectations and a reality for AdMech, where I think GW dropped the ball on this character and kind of the attached Kastelan robots, but I'm not going to get into too much detail on that. Just it's I just think it's really been nerfed big time, and it's really a shame to see. But the rest of the characters, I think the Technical Archaeologist has a nice 12-inch buff that prevents players from deploying near it, which I think is great. The Dominus and Manipulus are great, and the Tech Priest Engine Seer, strangely, is the only Tech Priest that can now repair units, which I think is a huge miss on GW's part. In 9th edition, I believe almost every Tech Priest character could repair vehicles, and I think in some cases even other Tech Priest units. I could be wrong, though. But removing that ability from all of them except the Engine Seer was kind of a mess, so hopefully our codex might address that, because I think it really goes against the lore of the characters, and also the idea that tech priests are masters of machines and masters of technology. So hopefully that'll get fixed, but maybe that's just something we'll have to live with for 10th edition. So without further ado, getting into, I've got three generic character ideas that I would love to see. I'm not a competitive player, even though I would love to and I probably will get into my first tournament maybe in a couple months. But I'm doing this mainly from, a casual player who plays with friends and family, and just cool things I'd like to maybe see on the tabletop. So starting with this and I've got a picture of uh, basically a princeps for rust stalkers, which is kind of currently when you field a unit of rust stalkers, you can get one kind of a sergeant-like character that leads the unit. But I think it would be awesome to have a new generic character, much like Space Marine Lieutenant, that could be attached to the unit, but that is optimized for um, being aligned with Sicarian units. And so in this case, it would be um, a character that would, and I'm thinking of something kind of a cross between a Skitarii Marshal and the current Ruststalker Princeps, because one of the standout features of Ruststalkers and Infiltrators is that they have a very fast 8-inch movement speed, and I think it would be awesome to have a leader character who could move that matches their movement speed and could be attached to them and give them extra capability. So I'm imagining basically having a Skitarii leader character that would maybe visually have the upper half of a Skitarii Marshal, or maybe that design influence, but then the lower half of that character's body would be just like what you see here for the Princeps. These metal legs that give them incredible speed and movement. In terms of buff, what I think this leader character could add, it could maybe give an advance plus charge capability when you're leading a unit of rust stalkers, and maybe when you build it as a leader for infiltrators, it has some other capability. But I would love to see a leader character for rust stalkers in addition to kind of the standard princeps. Second, and it's probably my favorite of all three of or maybe my second favorite of all the ideas for generic leader characters I would love to see, is a Skitarii Marshal on a Serberys. One of the things that drew me to AdMech is the amazing model design. And whoever at GW who was responsible, obviously it was a team of folks who worked on a bunch of different models, but my hat really goes off to them because they are just absolutely beautifully designed models. And the idea of having a Skitarii Marshal sitting on the back of a Sulfur Hound or a Raider with his cavalry saber outstretched and kind of urging on his basically like a cavalry captain leading the charge into the enemy, I think is a great visual. And I think it would be great to have Skitarii Marshal on Cerberus doing that. And I think there is a precedent. If you look at other armies and other factions, Space Marines have characters. There's so many characters you can't swing one without hitting another one. So they literally have dozens of characters. And you've got a Space Marine captain on a bike, you've got a chaplain on a bike, and I think having one Skitarii Marshal on either a Sulfur Hound or a Raider, giving you the option to kind of choose which one you want, would be awesome. And in terms of capabilities, a couple of things that I've noticed, and I'm not going to get into too much about where I think GW dropped the ball on AdMech, because there's a lot of kind of haves and have-nots, and I know that other players in other factions have kind of noted this too, but beyond the army rules and the detachments and the individual unit cards, there are a couple of big things that I think that GW missed in terms of balancing. And I think one of that is the ability for some units to get and use stratagems for 0 CP. And so basically, if you look at, I think it's a captain on a bike, he has in the Space Marine faction, has a rite of battle ability, and that lets basically use a stratagem for 0 CP cost. And there are a bunch of other armies, I guess, that have the ability to use a stratagem for 0 CP. And AdMech doesn't have any characters that have that ability at all. And so it seems like a kind of a balancing oversight. But this would be a great opportunity for GW to address that and introduce a character that gives AdMech the ability to use a stratagem for zero CP cost. But regardless, I think having a Skitarii Marshal charging in a battle in the back of one of these would be really cool. So I would love to see that. And finally, in terms of the generic leader characters, I would love to see a leader for these crazy Electro-Priests. So as any AdMech player knows already, you got the Fulgurites, who are these dudes right here, which are basically the melee Electro-Priests. They have a giant club that sparkles with electricity that they bash their enemies with, which is personally my favorite. And we also have the Corpuscari, which have basically, some people have described it as like magic jazz hand, the ability to kind of create electricity from these gauntlets on their hands. And these have also been nerfed a little bit in 10th, but I think adding a leader character who can lead either Fulgurites or Corpuscari would be fantastic. And I can, from a visual point of view, I could maybe see perhaps the leader character comes in a box, and you can build him one of two ways. In lore, the Corpuscari and Fulgurites kind of don't see eye to eye. They're kind of like two competing branches of the same religion. And so I don't think lore-wise you could maybe have one tech priest character lead both. So you'd have to maybe have a Fulgurite model where instead of holding, a giant stave like this guy has, maybe he has two separate like clubs or truncheons that he has that are electrified. And then for the Corpuscari, maybe you have someone who has got like a real-world plasma ball, one of these glass orbs that you touch and electricity kind of comes out from it. I could see that as kind of a cool visual. You could hold that and that would buff Corpuscari units around him. And in both cases, I think it would be really cool for that leader to bring back some of the really flavorful stuff that I think we lost in 10th edition for AdMech, which was, there was something called the Voltigite Blast and Motive Foresight that Fulgurites and Corpuscari had. Basically gave them some extra capabilities kind of around their their electricity-based theme, and I think having a leader that could add those would be great. Also, I think having a leader that would add advance and charge, because unfortunately our advance and charge stratagem only works on Skitarii units, and so which really kind of sucks, because the only unit, well, I guess you could use it on any Skitarii unit, but the Fulgurites especially are one of our Fulgurites and Kastelan robots are two of our great melee units, and the only stratagem we have that gives us advance and charge doesn't work on either of them. So, which seems like a mess, just from a balancing perspective. So anyway, those are my three. So those are the three generic leadership characters I'd love to see, and now I'd like to get into the epic characters I'd like to see. And so the difference here is, and I think it's great to have both, to have generic characters where players can, if they want to create their own backstories and own names for characters, having these generic characters I think is awesome. And I think Space Marines do this really well, where there's a bazillion kind of generic leaders, and I know there's a joke about, there's probably, 2 dozen, 3 dozen different Space Marine lieutenants, on a bike or with a knife or, standing or sitting or whatever. I mean, they've got a million different options, whereas, AdMech and practically every other faction in the game doesn't get that level of attention. But it would be great to see, some new epic characters as well. And when I say epic characters, I mean named characters. So these are characters that either come from lore, they have a specific name, they have a specific backstory, and as any AdMech player knows, our current only official named character is Belisarius Cawl, who is an awesome character. I think he's maybe a little expensive in the game, but I think he's a pivotal character in the 40k universe, and I think he's a great named epic character on the tabletop. But just kind of a quick aside here is there are actually two other named characters that kind of fly under the radar. They're not They can be played in hobby games. When I mean hobby games, I basically mean with friends and family. You can't take them to a tournament, like an official tournament, but you can use them because they are part of the Warhammer Legends category. And both of these characters and models are from the Warhammer Quest board game. And so the first is Servitor X101. He's kind of a more advanced Servitor model that was kind of featured in the Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress game. And here you see a picture of him. And the reason I'm not going to spend too much time on these guys is I feel like there's not a lot of attention paid to them, and even on the data sheets, like if you click on the link here that I've got on my blog post to go to the data sheet that has info on the Servitor, there isn't even a little kind of bio on the back that explains what the background is for the character. That's kind of just blank there, so it almost seems like an afterthought. But really, I think it's GW's attempt to let players who have purchased the Blackstone Fortress Warhammer Quest game to use these characters in game, which I think is great, and I think it's a nice kind of gesture on GW's part. So just wanted to get that out of the way, that there are two other named characters. Can't take them to tournaments, but if you have them, and neither one of them are particularly standout, I don't think, but you might want to take them in your game. So I mentioned Servitor X101, kind of a standard upgraded Servitor. The second is UR205, which I think had this robotic character who I think has a really cool backstory and is really intriguing. And I'm going to get into him a little bit later, but essentially the idea behind, I'll give you the quick background for this guy is that he's kind of positioned in the Warhammer Quest game as actually being a Men of Iron, basically an abominable intelligence that were outlined by the Imperium ages ago, and he's kind of flying under the radar, and he has this, I think on the Warhammer community site, where I got this image from, is they actually have a comment about him wearing the Imperial crest kind of on his chest to let people know that, I'm on a mission from a tech priest, but don't tell anyone. And so essentially it's kind of a cool, there's a lot of cool potential with this character, and I wish they would have maybe done a bit more with him. But anyway, just to kind of a quick aside, that there are two other named characters in addition to Belisarius Call that you could add to your army. So with that out of the way, let's get into the real choices here, where I think it would be great to see on the tabletop. And number one out of all the characters in here, I personally think, is Alpha Primus. So Alpha Primus is a character who, to give a little bit of backstory here, Rabute Gilliman gave, I believe, and I'm not a lore expert, so please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I believe Rabute Gilliman, who is the Primarch of the Ultramarines, gave an order to Belisarius Call at the end of the Horus Heresy, after Horus was defeated. The Emperor's put on the Golden Throne, and I think immediately thereafter, Rabute tasked Call with basically coming up with better Space Marines, and so that's where the Primaris Space Marines came from. And kind of an interesting prototype that Call had created was Alpha Primus, and I think Alpha Primus is a very cool character. He's featured fairly prominently in this awesome book from Guy Haley, Belisarius Call, The Great Work, which I recommend you pick up. But he's essentially the prototype that Call used and to test things and to basically, kind of finalize what he did to eventually create the Primaris Space Marines. And the way he's described is basically being a giant Space Marine, much larger than a traditional Space Marine, more like Custodes sized, almost not quite as big as a Primarch, but still being a very large Space Marine. And in everything that I've read, he's really depicted as being very formidable, not only from a melee and a ranged combat perspective, but fairly unique, kind of outside of Grey Knights and Librarians and other Space Marine chapters. Alpha Primus is also an incredibly powerful Psyker, and I've seen some stuff on Reddit and elsewhere where people have basically argued that, as described in lore, Primus could arguably one of the most powerful psychers in the entire Imperium. It's always difficult to take something in lore and make it match exactly, what it is on the tabletop. But I think having Primus on the tabletop as kind of a bodyguard unit or as a standalone unit, a bodyguard unit for Call or a standalone unit would be fantastic. And I love also the relationship between Call and Primus because it's very much like Frankenstein's monster and the relationship with Dr. Frankenstein who created him. So, there's a lot of cool backstory and other info about Primus that, I suggest you kind of explore on your own. But I think adding Primus as a bodyguard unit would be great. I think he's larger and stronger and more powerful than a traditional Space Marine. I've got some quotes from books here that you can read, just kind of see where I'm drawing all this from. But he's probably midway in power level between like a Primaris captain and a Primarch. I'm just guessing tabletop wise. Maybe not as powerful as say someone like the Blood Angels Mephiston or Dante, but somewhere maybe slightly below that in terms of power level. So he would be my number one epic name character that I wish GW would add to the tabletop for AdMech. And then finally, there's another character called QVO88. I won't get into too much detail about why this character is significant. He's also kind of an assistant to Call, but I think he would also be a great addition to the tabletop. And I think he adds, there's a way he could add some extra capability too. And one of the books, I think in the Great Work book, he generates like an energy shield that protects his compatriots from attack. So, he's a possibility as well. So getting into some other characters, and this is kind of an obscure pair of characters, but I really think these would be awesome characters, maybe even a little bit more so than Alpha Primus. And what I'm referring to are 13 Tor and Dostoyon Vladimus 12. I'm seeing here I need to go back and actually edit this note to add the actual page number where these characters are discussed. But essentially what these two characters are, so they are two distinct separate characters. And even though the image I'm using here shows two Kastelan robots that are painted the same, and this image came from Games Workshop, and I've linked it here. But basically, the story is that there were two Kastelan robots who essentially went rogue, and these are mentioned in the 9th edition Codex very briefly, almost like a paragraph or two, which I've quoted below. And essentially the idea is that these two robots have gone rogue, and they're now kind of wandering around the Imperium, and whenever the need is greatest, one of them shows up on the battlefield to help out the AdMech army in times of dire need. So here's the relevant excerpt, and this is actually the entire bit that talks about it. But essentially, and I'll read it really quickly here, but some maniples of Kastelan robots appear to have spent millennia facing strange directions and protocols programmed into them by masters thousands of years dead. These ancient machines call no forge world home and are instead itinerant. They often arrive in battle unheeded, their appearance taken as a sign of the machine god's favor. Constructs such as 13 Tor, known as the Automongrel of the Grainan Stellar Drawbridge, and Dostoyon Vladimus 12, the Iron Ghost of Farewell Secundus, fight until the battle is won, seemingly receptive to directives from tech priests. Afterwards, they disappear again, not seen perhaps for centuries. So I love, not only do I love the names, but I also love the, kind of subheads here, the Automongrel of the Grainan Stellar Drawbridge and the Iron Ghost of Farewell Secundus. I love this sort of alluding to things kind of out of lore, and Star Wars did an awesome job of this in the very first Star Wars movie, where it would mention things like the Kessel Run, and you would have no idea what that was, but it sounded really cool, and I think hats off to GW for doing that, in this case. But, in game, I would see these as two rogue Kastelan robots that have extra capabilities. They would be tougher, maybe, have more wounds, have better weapon skill, more attacks. Given their background, they wouldn't need a datasmith attached to them. They could be taken as standalone characters, and because of their random nature, maybe you couldn't bring them in until turn 2. Maybe they have a boosted repulsor grid ability that would let them wound attackers on 5s and 6s instead of 6s. Just throwing out ideas here. And the cool thing about this is you could actually GW could take the existing Kastelan robot box that has 2 Kastelans and a datasmith. Maybe remove the datasmith sprue and then give you an extra sprue that gives you just a couple of extra elements that makes each of these characters distinctive. And I would easily see one of them could be melee focused and the other one could be range focused. But I just love the idea of a random crazed Kastelan robot appearing on the battlefield from turn 2 onwards, arriving via deep strike or arriving off the edge of the board and basically just being kind of fulfilling the lore of those rogue robots that come onto the battlefield, help out AdMech, and then after the battle's over, they just kind of wander off into the sunset. And so I would love to see both of these characters show up. Kind of a long shot, kind of buried in the lore, but I thought it would be pretty cool. And then the third epic name character, as I mentioned earlier, and this is probably the one that I think has the best chance of ever appearing as an epic unique name character, is Subdomina Khepra, who is an NPC character. You can't actually play her in game, but she is a tech priest, kind of bridging the gap between like a tech priest and a Skitarii Marshal is kind of her role. But she's in the game Mechanicus. She's seen as a leader of Skitarii. She cares deeply about her troops, which is something that you don't see a lot in tech priest, which I think makes her a very unique perspective, opposed to kind of the lore, or at least most of the lore tends to view tech priests as kind of callous and indifferent to like turning prisoners into servitors and that sort of thing. They just see it as all kind of raw material. A lot of them see Skitarii as just cannon fodder to be sent to, kind of achieve the omniscience goals. But, throughout the game, Khepra is constantly expressing concern about her troops and that they're not wasted needlessly or they're not suffering needlessly and they have the support that they need. And so I think she would make an awesome, like I said, kind of a bridge tech priest to Skitarii Marshal character, maybe like still a tech priest, I guess, but more concerned with her Skitarii cohorts that she leads. And I've actually got a quote here from, which I found if you buy the Mechanicus PC game Omnissiah Edition, there is, you get the awesome soundtrack for the game, and you also get an awesome art book that's got loads of concept art and lots of other stuff. And this quote I actually pulled from that art book and gives you a bit more background into Khepra and what she does. And I'll read this really quickly. So Khepra is a military officer rather than a tech priest, so she provides a more human outlook, and I need to edit this, compared to the tech priests in the game. Faustinius, who's the leader of the expedition, finds her alternative outlook refreshing and is always impressed by her concern for the well-being of her troops, which is something Faustinius feels he is in danger of losing. He respects Khepra, even if the other tech priests do not, and usually accepts her advice on military matters. So in terms of on the tabletop, I think she would be an awesome leader character for Rangers and Vanguard, and I also think it would be great if she had maybe a ranged buff, say like any Skitarii unit within within a certain range, maybe a 6-inch range, kind of like what Call does on some of his stuff, would give them the ability to reroll hits. Or maybe, as I mentioned earlier, she could fill that gap where to give us a character that has the ability to use a stratagem for 0 CP, similar to the Rites of Battle ability that the Primus Captain has. So I would love to see this character on the tabletop, and I think it would help fill some of the gaps that we have and balance some things out without GW having to go in and massively change our army rule or our detachment, which I think I'll get to in a separate post, things I'd like to see them fix for that. But anyway, I think she would be a great addition to the game. Also, there's a lot of other Mechanicus game characters that are mentioned. There's Xenobiologist Tyrsus and Tech Acquisitor Scaevola. They're also very interesting characters. They lean towards wanting to acquire more Xenos technology to kind of study it, representing kind of a more open-minded approach to looking at Xenos technology. And I've got some screenshots that kind of show some of the characters and what they're referring to. And then another cool character that kind of represents the more traditional side of AdMech, and which sees all Xenos technology as heresy, is Lector Dogmatus Videx, who you see here, obviously scowling, probably thinking about all this Xenos technology that needs to be burnt. But he could be an interesting character too. Obviously, Khepra is the star here, and it would be great to see her first. But going back through other ideas for epic name characters, another great one would be Tech Priest Dominus Lunete, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. But she is the Tech Priest that kind of keeps the player's ship running in the Chaos Gate Demon Hunters game, which is another excellent Warhammer game. It's very difficult, but I love the original XCOM, and I think Chaos Gate is a great game in that genre. Very difficult though, but I would heartily recommend that also. But Lunete is she's actually the tech priest that runs the ship, and in game she kind of serves the role of being almost like a Spock-like character. She's very logical. You can go to her and get advice on how to repair the ship and how to upgrade the ship, and she handles all that stuff. But unlike Khepra, you can actually, I think you have to get the Duty Eternal DLC to play her, but there are a few missions, I think at least 2, maybe more, where you can actually get to play her in game, and she's got some really cool kind of Mechanicus themed abilities, can repair other units, which unlike most of our tech priest characters, she can actually repair units in games. So I think I think she would also be a great addition to the game. So those are kind of my top picks, and out of the sake of completeness, I wanted to include some other name characters that I've seen. Again, I'm relatively new to 40K, and I've read a bunch of the AdMech lore, but not all of it. So there are a couple other characters I've seen mentioned and kind of come across as I was learning about AdMech. I've already mentioned UR205, and I'm just naming him here because I think he's a really cool character, and stressing again that I hope GW kind of expands on that Men of Iron motif and how it kind of ties into AdMech, which I'll get into in a bit. Hieronomus Tezla, he was a Xenorite runic tech priest from Styges 8. There was an old Inquisitor game that was produced about 20 years ago, I'm guessing, 15, 20 years ago, that had a bunch of these AdMech characters. Another one is Delphan Gruss. He's another character that maybe could come back to the tabletop, and maybe be adapted for 40K. For all of these, I linked where a good source for you to find out more in the blog post, to find out more about these characters. So feel free to explore. And then finally, we get to kind of the crazy blue sky, wouldn't it be cool if sort of section of the blog post, where I talk about other epic hero ideas. So here we're looking at, first, I love how, not so much Kastelan, I might have to go back in and change this to Kataphron, actually, because that's really my intent here. But, the idea of combining, and this is big with AdMech, combining, human biology with augments. And you can see it in Kataphron Breachers and Destroyers, where they've taken servitors and turned them into basically military vehicles that are controlled by what's left of the human that's there. And especially for maybe newer or younger 40K players who aren't as old as I am, I saw the original RoboCop movie in the theater, way back in 1987, and it's still one of the best science fiction movies ever made. If you haven't seen it and you're an AdMech fan, you should absolutely watch it, because not only is it an excellent movie, it's an excellent sci-fi movie. It's got some great action, but it touches on a couple of themes that I think are really that have not been touched on a lot for AdMech. And one of the things that I'm referring to is that the protagonist of the movie is there's a really kind of idealistic, really good police officer, because he's called Murphy. He basically gets murdered very brutally, very graphically in the original. So I would recommend you watch the original, even though it's graphic and it's very brutal. It definitely sets the stage for what he goes through. But he's murdered by this nasty gang of thugs, and Omni Consumer Products is the company that basically brings him back to life, and as RoboCop. And there's a very cool and very understated kind of thread that goes through the movie about the humanity of Murphy, how he basically was taken, essentially his brain and his head and just portions of his his lungs and some other parts of his organs were the only things that were left. And he's completely lost his memory, and throughout the movie he gradually starts to remember who he was. He remembers the family that he used to be with, and there's a really poignant, very kind of thoughtful thread in the movie that's really kind of grounds the movie, and I think really elevates it to being just a fantastic must-watch movie. But I think that thread of kind of losing your humanity as you get turned into this this powerful cyborg meting out justice. There's the human side of it too, and I think there's a great opportunity here for GW to do more of that, both from a fiction point of view, but also from a tabletop point of view. And so looking at RoboCop, the idea of taking humans that have been wounded, and I know Space Marines do this, they take their most wounded Space Marines and put them in dreadnoughts, but I think there's a lot of extra potential here for AdMech where, well, what about in that RoboCop vein, why not take Adeptus, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Adeptus Arbites, officers and that fall in the line of duty. AdMech could basically resurrect them as cyborgs, Kataphron cyborgs that are basically cyborg police for AdMech, or they could do the same for Imperial Guardsmen who operated artillery, and those characters become a new bunch of Kataphron units that do indirect fire. Or I just think there's a lot of opportunity here, and I also couldn't resist throwing in a picture of RoboCop here. Again, awesome movie, one of my favorites. You should definitely go watch it. So another thing is, and I'm getting into more of the blue sky stuff, I think it would be cool to have a cyberpunk style assassin hacker character, and I've got a screen grab here actually from the Cyberpunk video game that shows the Manus Blades enhancement. And obviously this kind of shows a higher level of, or a more seamless and kind of clean level of technology than you commonly see in 40K, but I still think it would be cool for us to have assassin and hacker characters really kind of diving into more deeply into that part of kind of the cyborg genre, where we have assassin characters that have abilities like this, or we have a tech priest / hacker that can take over enemy vehicles or do extra damage to them, or do some other things. So I think that would be really cool. So anyway, getting into my final idea, and I think a lot of other people, or at least a few other people might have noticed this, but if you really look at a couple of the robotic characters throughout 40K. So in this case, looking at this first picture here is a Leagues of Votann Ironkin, which are basically sentient robot characters that the Votann literally treat just the same as a flesh and blood Votann, which I think is an awesome kind of an awesome take. But you can see the very kind of 60s robot style here with with the dome here, where just the look is very 60s, like Danger Will Robinson, that sort of robot style, 50s and 60s robots. And then, lo and behold, you look at the AdMech Kastelan robots, and look at that. They have a very similar design aesthetic, kind of that rounded head, the rounded pauldrons, the very barrel-chested torso. And as you keep scrolling down here, we see here's UR205, which has been billed in the Warhammer Quest game as a kind of a man of iron in disguise. And so if you kind of, if you read into the lore, basically, the Men of Iron were sentient, essentially kind of the Terminator idea where, and 40K, I think, does, I think they do an awesome job of pulling from a lot of other sources. I mean, you really can't, if you look at 40K, it's obvious that Games Workshop drew from a lot of different literary sources, like, for example, Isaac Asimov's Foundation, about the galaxy-spanning empire, and about priests that kind of worship technology. You've got Dune, the Dune movies, the Navigators. You've got Paul Atreides, who becomes kind of the one superpowered character, kind of like the Emperor of Mankind. So GW is drawn from all these, kind of standing on the shoulders of giants to kind of come up with the 40K lore and universe, which, I think is great. But I think also that kind of cool idea that there was this huge galaxy-spanning battle between the Men of Iron and humans, basically for survival in the lore. And, again, I'm not as well-versed in the lore in this area as other people, so please correct me if I'm wrong in comments here or on YouTube, or on the blog post. But the Men of Iron were defeated, and UR205 essentially is a Man of Iron who's basically behaving like an Adeptus Mechanicus creation to stay alive, but also kind of doing that to kind of further his own secretive ends, which, and basically all of this discussion gets around to, I think there's a huge opportunity here for GW to expand on this. There could be units that the Leagues of Votann field that are obviously connected to, more closely to Kastelan robots, for example. And I would love to see, maybe different types of Kastelan robots. And I would love to see maybe more and larger units that kind of take that Ironkin look. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think it's kind of a cool lore thread that could be developed more in the future. And that's it. That's kind of the sum of my total crazy ideas. And I would love to hear from all of you about, if you think I missed any characters, which I know I did, please add a comment, and I would love to learn about them. But please like and subscribe on YouTube so you can kind of be notified when I've got other videos to post. You can also connect with me on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and via my account on Reddit. And you can also sign up for free here to be. I haven't started it yet, but I'll eventually like to send out a free monthly email newsletter with free content, totally free, to kind of keep you updated on what I'm up to. And with that, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, add comments if you've got other things to add, and things that maybe other characters I missed, or other games or other books that have got great AdMech characters that you think would make great additions to the tabletop. So with that, I will talk to you all later. Thanks.